America's borders aren't where you think they are. How Pax Americana is becoming Pax Silica, and how most Americans or most people around the world aren't really made aware of just exactly how wide America's borders are. When most Americans hear the word border, they probably picture this, a big line running from San Francisco to the Gulf of America, then another stretching from Washington state to Maine. Maybe somebody remembers Alaska and Hawaii, and that's about it. Ask the average American to locate America's Samoa on a map, and suddenly you've got a room full of people pretending they have an important text message. American Samoa? Isn't that like near Florida and the Bahamas? No, and it gets worse. There are U.S. territories, possessions, and even bases scattered around the Pacific and Caribbean that most Americans couldn't identify if you gave them multiple choice. The Marshall Islands, Nassau Island, Guam. Anyway, you get the point. The United States has a geographic footprint that is considerably stronger than the 50-state map hanging in your elementary school classroom, or that you've been told happens to be the country, quote-unquote, United States. But here's the interesting part. America's borders don't actually stop at its geographic borders. In fact, you could argue that America's most important borders haven't been geographic for a very long time. They are military, economic, cultural, technological, and increasingly digital. And this brings us to something called Pax Americana. Chapter 1. The American border is bigger than America. So let's state the obvious. The United States is a country. It has borders. Those borders are legally defined, but America's strategic territory and de facto region of control is much larger. Why? Because Washington has spent roughly 8 decades building a system in which countries outside America's borders operate inside an American-led security and economic architecture. The biggest mistake people make is thinking that after World War II, the United States simply gave everything up. That is not at all what happened. Think about Europe. Germany isn't America. Japan isn't America. South Korea, Australia, they're not America. But if you're a decision maker in Beijing or Moscow trying to figure out where American military power actually begins, you probably aren't going to draw a line around Texas and call it a day. In fact, what do you think this Iran situation is all about? What do you think is going on in Cuba? Or what about North Korea? I mean, you're looking at it. There's NATO, American bases, of which we have 800 plus around the world, defense treaties, naval deployments, intelligence sharing networks. And on that note, it's not like a lot of these countries are in a position to defend the United States, quote unquote. It's more of the United States exerting its influence to defend them and their interests, and that their interests remain American-based. The U.S. dollar itself, countries cannot purchase commodities without going through the U.S. dollar. Global shipping routes, which are protected and guaranteed by the U.S. Navy, semiconductor supply chains, and of course the famous or infamous American nuclear umbrella. That's a very different kind of border. It's a sphere of influence backed by institutions and power. And that is essentially what people mean when they are talking about Pax Americana, the relatively stable international order created and maintained in large part by American economic, military, and diplomatic power after World War II. The United States didn't conquer most of its territory. It didn't plant American flags in Tokyo, Berlin, and Seoul. Instead, it built something considerably more sophisticated. It convinced, or sometimes pressured, other countries to plug into the American system. And once you're plugged in, disconnecting isn't exactly like canceling Netflix. Chapter 2, the nuclear umbrella. One of the clearest examples is the American nuclear umbrella. Take Japan. Japan doesn't possess an independent nuclear arsenal. Neither does South Korea, nor does Canada. Several European allies don't. Instead, they rely in part or in full on the United States for extended nuclear deterrence. In simple terms, America is promising that attacking certain allies around the world could bring America into the fight, and countries do not want that. That's an extraordinary thing because the United States is effectively extending part of its strategic security perimeter beyond the American mainland. Their physical border might be the Pacific Ocean. Their strategic border, much farther away. If a hostile power threatens Japan, South Korea, NATO territory, Washington isn't thinking, well, that's not our war. They're outside of our zip code. Not at all. Those countries are inside America's strategic security architecture, and that's why American alliances are so powerful. Much more than that, that's why other countries want it. The border isn't just a fence, it is a commitment. And our rivals know it. But our people don't. Chapter 3, America's Invisible Borders. But military alliances are only half the story. The other half is economic and cultural. Walk into a shopping mall anywhere in the world and you're going to encounter American brands. Apple, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Nike, Disney. Go on TV, there's Netflix, Hollywood movies. Check out the music. It's American music. Where do kids want to go to school? American universities. What is definitely on the up and up? American technology. Our financial institutions as well. The American cultural footprint is enormous. And then there are supply chains. A smartphone might be designed in California. A Korean company might put their name on it, but it uses American software, contains Taiwanese semiconductor, aka the part of China that the United States heavily, quote unquote, influences. Japanese components, Korean displays, and Chinese manufacturing. Korean displays and Chinese manufacturing, which means that the American sphere isn't necessarily defined by ownership. It's defined by integration. That's an important distinction. America doesn't need to manufacture every component to have enormous influence over the system. It can influence the standards, software, finance, intellectual property, logistics, and markets connecting the components. For decades, this worked extremely well. America had a huge consumer market, its allies specialized, global trade expanded, capital flowed, and companies moved production wherever it was cheapest. And the United States sat near the center of the machine, and that machine was Pax Americana. But now, that machine is changing. Chapter 4, the North American Core. And this brings us to the biggest changes happening today. America is increasingly focused on strengthening the North American core, which is the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Look at the geography. You've got enormous energy resources in Canada and the United States, massive agricultural production, the world's largest consumer market, Mexican manufacturing, Canadian minerals and energy, American capital, and American technology. These countries connected by an enormous continental transportation network, and unlike much of the world, this region has something extremely valuable: geographic insulation. It's got 2 oceans, friendly neighbors for the most part, huge amounts of food, water, energy, demographics, industrial capacity, and a relatively stable political environment, even though it might not look it from time to time. That's a really good starting position. And Washington increasingly has an incentive to make that continental system harder to disrupt. Think about the lessons of the pandemic, the war in Ukraine. Think about the semiconductor shortages. Then think about China's dominance in various critical supply chains. Suddenly, the question is, can America buy this product cheaply? The question becomes, can America still get this product when the world gets ugly? And that's a completely different question. This is why the United States is strengthening its ties with its Mexican and Canadian neighbors. Canada and Mexico might not be giving up their sovereignty from a border or an official standpoint, but Canada and Mexico will be tied to the American system and they will be benefiting from it, as they have been already. Chapter 5, from Pax Americana to Pax Silica. And this is where I think we're seeing something bigger emerge. It's called Pax Silica. Pax Americana was heavily based on American military power, global trade, alliances, and institutions. Pax Silica is increasingly about something more fundamental and more dividing: technology. As you can imagine, it includes semiconductors, AI, cloud computing, advanced manufacturing, robotics, the works. And you might be thinking that this is just one industry, but in reality, it holds much more importance than that, as much as the Industrial Revolution did when Great Britain was the only power that had it in the beginning of the 19th century. Because here's the uncomfortable reality. You can have the world's most powerful military, but if your advanced chips come from somewhere else, you have a problem. You can have the world's largest economy, but if your critical pharmaceutical ingredients come from somewhere else, particularly a rival, you have a problem. You can have the biggest aircraft carriers in the world, but if you can't produce the components required to maintain them, then you have a very expensive floating problem. That's why manufacturing is becoming strategic again. Not necessarily because America wants to make every toaster in Ohio. That's not realistic. But because there are certain industries where dependence becomes dangerous. And those industries are increasingly being treated like strategic territory. Chapter 6, the new American border. This changes what we mean by the word border. The old border was, where does American territory end? The new question is, where does American strategic dependence end? That's much harder to map. Imagine a map of North America. You could draw America's geographic border, then draw its military alliances, then its trade agreements, then its technology partnerships, supply chains, semiconductor ecosystem, energy network, and a digital infrastructure. Suddenly, your map doesn't look like the United States anymore. It looks like a gigantic web. And that's the real competition of the 21st century. Not necessarily who owns the most land. And I recommend that you take a look as to why Great Britain in the 19th century insisted on holding that land, but who controls the systems everyone else depends on for their industrialization, just to stick around. And this is where America's geographic advantages become extremely important, because the United States doesn't have to dominate every quarter of the planet. It can concentrate power where it matters most, strengthen the North American core, secure the sea lanes of trade, maintain alliances in Europe and Asia, prevent power rivals, protect critical technology, rebuild strategic manufacturing, and keep the financial and technological architecture centered around the United States and its genuine allies. That's a very different strategy from simply trying to police the entire world, and cheaper too. Conclusion: America's border is a system, and it's time Americans understood that. So when somebody says America needs to defend its borders, the obvious question is, which borders? The geographic borders? Absolutely, but America's strategic borders are much larger. They stretch through treaty commitments. Again, look at what's happening in Iran. Most Americans don't seem to understand that Iran is at the border of Pax Americana. They stretch through treaty commitments, nuclear deterrence, trade, finance, culture, technology, supply chains, and manufacturing. For most of the post-war era, America benefited enormously from this system. So the world became more interconnected. America's companies became global. Consumers got cheaper goods. Allies became wealthier. Securing the Strait of Hormuz isn't, as President Trump has pointed out, isn't to secure oil for the United States, but it's to secure oil for our system and for our allies. And America became the central hub of the enormous international network. That being said, it is finding itself at odds with some of these particular allies in when it comes to their involvement in the system, and that will be dealt with. And that same globalization creates vulnerabilities. Now Washington is rebuilding and redesigning some of the industrial and technological depth that was allowed to move overseas. That means strengthening the North American core, securing critical supply chains, protecting advanced technology, encouraging domestic manufacturing, and making sure that the technologies defining the next century aren't controlled by America's strategic competitors. So perhaps the great geopolitical transition isn't simply Pax Americana is ending, the American empire is ending, blah, blah, blah. Maybe it's something more complicated. Perhaps Pax Americana is evolving from an order based primarily on military supremacy and globalization toward an order increasingly based on higher levels of technology, resilient supply chains, continental industrial and technological power, and control of the systems that make modern civilization possible. Call it Pax Silica. Do you enjoy Wi-Fi? Do you enjoy social media? Do you enjoy all these things? Pax Silica. Because in the 21st century, the most important border might not be drawn with barbed wire. It might be drawn inside a semiconductor. And if you control the chip, you might have a lot more control over the world than the guy guarding the border fence ever did. Thank you for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe. If you have any questions, please list them below. Have a great day.